So going back to like more concrete examples from our conversation previously and from some other podcasts that I know that you've been to, I know that you have a very cool story about setting a very ambitious project optimization goal in one of the projects that you work on. So I would like you to talk a little bit about the goal and also a process of how you set those kind of goals and how you set them in large scale projects.
Sure. Yeah, I think that probably the the one that people are most interested in is the 200 millisecond app launch time target that we had on a particular consumer electronics project. And I didn't set that goal. That was set by the kind of product vision team. So it wasn't even set by like design, like product designers necessarily. It was set by kind of people high up in the kind of product development organization. And then there were some other constraints going into that as well, like the technology leadership really wanted to use web technologies, but they knew that they didn't want to use. You had a browser-based UI in there for the previous version of their device, and while we've all seen great performing web UIs, it can be done.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, it just couldn't be done with those people at that time with that product. The performance was extremely poor. The stability was extremely poor. Undeniably, like it was like a accepted problem that they had. But they're like, we want to use web technologies, and so and they did have a team of dedicated engineers to maintaining their kind of browser runtime, which is WebKit based. And so this was the same at a previous company that I was at, Blue Jeans. They had kind of a bad experience with Node WebKit. And there's no reason Node WebKit couldn't perform, but they just had real trouble with it. So they were like, we don't want a browser. We don't want any browser-based UI. And so it's kind of the same constraints where they had a kind of an existing corpus of JavaScript code. They had a bunch of talent that knew JavaScript and new web technologies. So the way I was kind of looking at it was, what can we do with this existing talent pool that we have and the kind of existing supporting infrastructure that we have that can, like, desymbolicate, this is a made up word, but can kind of like take JavaScript stack traces like that have been obfuscated by Babel or whatever and like turn them into something nicer for the developers that are looking at trying to debug crashes and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of pieces of it. Some of we talked about, like, how do we support this thing? How do we automate the performance benchmarking? But then also React Native made a lot of sense there, because it's like, well, people still get to program in JavaScript, and there is still kind of a tag-based or declarative language underneath that, right? So it should be mostly in people's wheelhouse, but as we know, like, React can be a paradigm shift from coming from other frameworks like Ember or Angular, things like that. And maybe they've gotten closer together in the intervening years. I don't know. Excuse me. But yeah, it was really, how do we do that with the talent pool that we have in the kind of ecosystem? And React Native was further along at that point. Like, there were major apps shipping with it. It wasn't just one or two, it was like 10 or 12. And so the kind of proof point was there. It wasn't nearly as radical of an idea with this 200 millisecond app launch project as it was with Blue Jeans. Whereas with Blue Jeans, yeah, you had like Wix out talking about it, and Airbnb's app was kind of using it, but like there was not like a groundswell. It was difficult to tell if it was a technology that people could be successful with repeatedly, like over and over again. And it wasn't just isolated to just a few geniuses in the world. But by the time we got to this consumer electronics device, it was pretty, in my mind, quite de-risked. So the big first question was, well, how do we start prototyping. We didn't have any designs. And it's kind of coming in hot. So what we started to do was to kind of recreate the existing Ember-based WebKit apps in React Native, because that's like, well, we don't need a design. We can just copy what we did and make sure that we have all the React Native controls that we need, that there's no weird hidden gotchas or there's no kind of memory leaks. Like we can kind of like, I think we tried to use the same UI automation, test automation that QA had in the React Native version of the apps as well. But also in consumer electronics devices, and it was the same at multiple companies that I've kind of been at, you get some new piece of hardware and it's like tip-top secret. So it's like in a hidden room behind 8 locks, and like you need 5 people to turn the key at the same time. And so people are kind of disclosed about the details of the project in very small batches, like batches of 5 or 8 or something, 5 or 10 or something like that. And part of that is just information control, so that if something leaks, they know, well, it might have been this cohort. And sometimes they would do interesting things like give slightly incorrect information, like some specific number that doesn't matter for app development, but that would be slightly wrong, like the exact amount of RAM or the exact amount of compute units. And then if that number got leaked out, they kind of knew which cohort it kind of came out of. But I think we started with 6 or 8 people. And the big thing for me was, let's train these people with experts, React Native sort of experts. And so we brought in folks from Callstack that had been kind of running React Native open source releases for a couple of years at that point. And then we brought in this Dots Labs, and they had some trainers. And then there was a third place I'm not going to mention because their training wasn't great. I'm not going to advertise for something that ended up not being great. But but we kind of brought in a diversity of people, of actual practitioners, not people who memorized a book, not people who memorized a training or just looked at the slides and said it while it was happening. Yeah. Because we had, the individual contributor engineers that we were training in these batches of 5 or 8 or 10 had real questions, technical questions, and needed real technical answers. Like, yeah, but when I do this, when I try to use, not a hook, but when I try to use Redux to do this that has this effect, what is that? And then the other thing was that because this product organization had such a problem with performance and stability in their previous product, I kind of played like the editor-in-chief of the training content. So I kind of told the training firms, Callstack and this dot, like, I want to cover like unit testing and performance, and so I said, what are like 3 examples of typical things that cause re-renders in React and React Native that you see, the mistake people make over and over again. I want to cover those, and I want to cover how to kind of use React dev tools to be able to observe them happen. Because on a desktop or whatever, like it can happen so fast you don't even notice it's only on lower end hardware or when the hardware is under duress. And so we had kind of had that focus because everything else at that time, you could kind of go to Stack Overflow. There's a lot of Medium blog posts, a lot of YouTube stuff. There was a lot of content out there about what to do, but there wasn't a lot of content out there about what not to do. Like, here are the things to avoid. There wasn't a lot of content like that yet. And so that's what the training kind of focused on. And that worked pretty well. So we sort of trained people with a focus on performance and developer testing, but also just learning React Native and how all the layers work and how the async bridge works and a bunch of other technical details. And I think it was about 6 months in or so, we settled on using React Navigation. And so we started to fold React Navigation stuff into our into the trainings as well. Here's how to set up routes. Here's these things. We submitted pull requests to React Navigation. And just to back up for 1 second, for me, I think part of the challenge of the stability and the performance in the previous product was because they had hard forked so many projects. So they were kind of in these weird forks outside of the regular ecosystem. Or in the case of Ember, they were using stock Ember, but they had kind of customized their use of it in such a way that there was no patterns that they could look at in the ecosystem or the community at that point.
And no one could help out, and no one could contribute to like custom solution.
Yeah. Right. And then with my business hat on, in terms of onboarding people, how quickly from hire do you get to net positive contribution, right? Where they can make a commit, they can make a PR, the review is over pretty quick. It gets merged. They don't need to revert, within a week's time or something like that. That was really important to me in terms of scaling up the effort.